Javier. Okay, great. All right, it's 5:25 Eastern and Dominica time, and we're going to get going with the questions and answers. Thank you so much to everyone who's joined the session, and thank you to Michael for making a pretty incredible film. I have the pleasure and the privilege of interviewing you. I also have the pleasure and privilege of having met you in Dominica. I watched this film with my kids in May, and in the middle of the storm part of the film, they started to lose it. They're 5 years old, and they're like, what happens to Michael? What happens to Michael? And a couple of weeks later, we saw Michael in town, and they're like, Michael's alive. It was a surreal moment. So Michael, you've already got a following. In many ways, a number of people in the chat. So this is a real story, right? It's around resilience. I think there's a climatic aspect to it. There's a human aspect to it. And it resonates evidently with people around the world. I have so many questions. I'm going to try and catch as many as I can from the chat. But let me ask you the first most obvious one, which is, how is climate change and our need to adapt to resilience climatically different from COVID? I'm sorry I have to ask that question. You know, it's an existential moment.
How is it different from COVID? Well, I mean, I guess some of the specific things we'd be talking about implementing would be different, but in many ways, I think you're talking about the same things, because we're talking about resilience at the end of the day. And so just like after Maria, in many ways, we were cut off from the rest of the world. That's kind of what's happened with COVID again. So again, you're kind of seeing, do you have a strong community? Do you have natural resources? When I say natural resources, I mean food, water, agriculture, all of that stuff. Essentially, can you get by? Will you be able to survive and survive well when something like this happens? And that's, honestly, it's not something that is possible for every place, at least right now. But maybe it is something that, you know, not everywhere is as tropical as Dominica, but there are still ways around it.
Yeah. Sorry, I had to lead with that question. And I realize I haven't, you know, done formal introductions, but I don't want to take too much time. I think that's the obvious question, but, you know, one of the points that stands out most from the film for me, and I think for a number of people on the chat, is the last part of it, right? That's profound. I would say the last 2 minutes, the wood and the water, the circles, the imagery, the silence, and yet your words kind of penetrating, are extremely powerful. So for me, the end is profound. But it suggests that resilience is above and beyond to anything. It's within oneself.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. I think even from some of the questions that have been touched in the chat, I think that there hasn't necessarily been enough talk about the relationship between our inner and outer worlds. And so, you know, we can say, yeah, we're consuming too much and we're doing this and we're doing that, but the core question is why? And that has to do with how we relate to ourselves in the world.
Okay. Are humans fundamentally resilient?
Are humans fundamentally resilient? I would say so, at least
as a so generalization.
Far, at least so far, but we'll, you know, give it time, give it another 500,000 years, million years, and we'll find out.
You know, I think it changes over time. I think one can be resilient in a physical sense, right? So, you know, there are people who've been locked up in prisons for 30 years, right? Only to be declared innocent. How many of those have we seen? They've survived, you know, solitary confinement. They've survived tremendous emotional, physical, and other abuse. So you can come out of it perhaps intact in a structural way. Mental resilience, emotional resilience. How did you get through eating worms and rotten fish? I think there's some people are concerned about that for you. How did you get through that? And I don't want to answer my own question, but is it that you had the 6-month target in mind, so there was an end game? There were points where it looked like you were losing it, and then you came back. What were the triggers for coming back?
I think at least part of it in this instance was, you know, this is something I had chosen for myself. So, you know, sometimes in life you're like, oh, it's not fair. This is, this is the way it is, but I didn't choose this. I chose everything. So at a certain point, I was like, who can I really be upset at or upset for? There's no real reason to sort of be upset in that way. I will say there was like a time when I was rebuilding my shelter and I didn't get it fixed up in time. And all I had was a little towel over the frame and it poured raining. And of course the towel was soaked through and I couldn't lie down because it was muddy. So I spent the night on my knees with my head like this, just in the mud. And at first I was like, wow, this is a catastrophe. This sucks. And then I was like, no, it's not really. It is like a little bit cold and uncomfortable, and that's about it. And so I think a lot of our suffering in many ways is concepts and thoughts that we've layered on top of what the actual reality is. The reality just essentially being the perception, the input coming in, and then we decide to contextualize it as good or bad.
Right. I think there's contextualization. There's probably also relativism, right? So how bad is this relative to the next thing, right? So I'm sure when you woke up after Maria, I don't even know how you slept through that, but when you woke up after Maria, I bet you were thinking, I thought it was bad yesterday, but
Yeah, exactly.
relatively speaking,
Exactly.
this is okay. So what does resilience mean to you today versus what it meant to you going into the forest, within the forest, your worst few days in the forest versus today? You're back to, almost normal, whatever that looks like. Has your perspective on the definition of resilience changed?
Well, resilience wasn't really a catchword before I went into the forest. So it wasn't a word I was particularly thinking about. So I don't know how to answer that one for you. Right afterwards to now, I think the biggest thing is just in general a shift of mindset of realizing that you can get through most things, and at the end is death, which is the worst, and it's coming anyway. So you kind of grit your teeth and get through.
Well, it's the worst or it's inevitable. And for some people, it may not be the worst thing that
Absolutely.
they've had to, experience. It's unknown, that's for sure.
Yeah.
There are a number of comments around Dominica, and just to go back to the original poll that we'd asked at the beginning how many people have been to Dominica, just under 50%, I think. I need to go back to the poll. And how many people had survived a serious hurricane, right? I mean, I've been through a minor tornado, but that doesn't quite, it doesn't quite compare. And there are a number of people who, particularly in the Indian Ocean, have gone through events. So it's 50-50 actually. Wow, 50%. It's amazing to see. Well, so 25% of those on the call or who responded to the poll, 24% been to Dominica, but 50% have been through a major climatic or hurricane event. It's amazing how, pretty much everyone I've spoken to in the climate space, in the disaster space, will say, this is the worst region, right? Southeast Asia is the worst. The Caribbean is the worst affected. The Pacific is the worst affected, Southern Africa has got, if it's not a hurricane, it's drought. So everyone thinks their situation is the worst. What's interesting with Dominica is that, so for full disclosure to those on the call, I'm Dominican by birth, but have never lived there, and had the privilege of leading the Climate Resilience Execution Agency for about 2 years, from its inception until about a month ago. When I arrived in Dominica in 2018, I spoke to people, particularly those who'd come off cruise ships. They're like, oh, it looks like nothing happened. Again, the physical, right? So structures have been rebuilt. People have patched up their houses. The streets are clean. There are no traffic lights. So, there's no issue with traffic lights not working. The place functions. Is that a true reflection of the resilience of Dominica's people? Or does the outside perhaps belie or hide something that has been permanently affected by the passage of Maria, and before that, Tropical Storm Erica?
I mean, I think that Dominicans are a rather resilient people. But I would also say, I mean, as strong or resilient as all of us are, when we go through traumas, there's going to be effects, and there's going to be scars, and even if they're not physical, they will be internal. So there are plenty of people that obviously lost loved ones in traumatic ways and will never forget that night. And there's people still who, once they hear the sound of heavy rain, you know, it brings back those triggers. So, I mean, once you have any sort of event that powerful and that causes that much damage, you know, we can all have a well put together exterior, but you can't really escape trauma. At least some section of us are going to experience it. And so then it's how do you heal from that and work through it?
Right. And how do you heal from that?
Well, I would say you got to process. You got to you got to do spiritual work, essentially internal work. You're gonna have to let go of a lot of things. But hey, I'm not a therapist.
Yeah, well, you
Also,
know,
just saying before we go too far, there are people saying about their questions in the chat getting neglected.
yeah, so can I tell you what's happened? And I'm afraid to press any button. My chat screen has frozen, probably because I went up to look at the poll. So I now can't click in the chat. And I am worried that if I press refresh, the Zoom's going to disconnect. So I have some questions that I noted before. Can I maybe start with those? And Michael, can you jump in if you're able to see at the same time?
Yeah, sure.
Sorry for interviewing yourself. There was a question a couple of minutes ago about housing development, airport, CBI, Citizenship by Investment program in Dominica. One of the questions was, is Dominica going the right way? What's your view on that?
Yeah, that is a tough question. I mean, obviously, everywhere we want jobs, we want new things, we want investments and everything else. But from my understanding with so many of these sorts of large resorts, it seems that they extract more than they give. Many times it seems like it's sort of low-level service jobs that come into the country. A lot of the management is foreign. And even if not, you know, the owners are foreign, and a lot of that money gets funneled out of the country while the natural resources and the environment of the island pay the price. So I would not say that that's the ideal direction to go, especially not as a main focus for sure.
If I could add to that, I fully agree. I mean, I think what's unique about Dominica is that it is untamed. It's indomitable, right? We've spoken about this in the past, from the Kalinago peoples to the slave descendants to, you know, to Hurricane David, you know, Erica, Maria, whatever. Dominica and Dominicans have survived. But in large part, I think the island is defined by its geography, right? Its topography. It is very, very hard to master Dominica. And I think that one of the biggest tragedies that one could expect to happen to Dominica would be to turn it into what every other, you know, tourist destination looks like. So on the one hand, I think tourism provides an opportunity to uplift the economy in certain ways if it's done thoughtfully, carefully, respectfully. At the same time, I think what is really interesting about Dominica is its agriculture. So Dominica can feed itself. Dominica was at one point a breadbasket for the Caribbean, and I think it's regaining that position after Maria. Mm-hmm. So in a time of COVID, in a time of, you know, reliance on basic needs for survival, basic produce for survival, I think agriculture is a space that needs to be further explored in Dominica, right? Organic or sustainable or, you know, true to environmentally sensitive principles. Tourism can always come on top of that, but that's my personal and slightly biased view. I did catch a question here. I've refreshed. If you were standing in front of a world leader, I'm trying to get back to that question. What would you say to him or her, which I added, who ignores climate change? What would you say to him or her?
I would probably invite them to come and spend hurricane season or monsoon season or something like that. And I think that's the best way, because honestly, if you're denying it at this point, it's like clearly statistics or anything else don't really mean anything to you. So come experience it.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. But if they didn't have a chance to experience it, do you think there's anything that could be said or demonstrated to show them, you know, that this
Hon-
happens?
Honestly, I don't know. I mean, to me, it's either experience it or something, at least hopefully a film like this can have them experience it without having to fly to the Caribbean during hurricane season.
And wait
But
for it, and wait for it, right?
at the end of the day, something we've seen with COVID and pretty much everything else and politics is people decide to take up a certain position, and reason or anything else won't really sway them.
Yeah,
So, and this is the kind of my biggest fear with something like climate change. At least with COVID, we saw the immediate aftermath of when governments, not in Dominica, but world governments, especially America, for instance, did not act in time. We saw the direct repercussions, and we're still fighting about how should we, remedy it. The problem with something like climate change is by the time we see those sorts of repercussions, is it going to be too late? And to me, then you and I touched on this question. How do you sort of get people and or governments to act in a different way? And one of the things that kind of came up, this is not a solution by any means, just amusing. A thought with a friend, just talking about some of the issues with democracy, where having to vote for politicians every 4 years or so, however often, that politicians then essentially in every democracy have to somewhat pander to the population to get elected, which then makes it difficult to enact long-term policies or action plans that might not be popular in the moment, but that might save us 50 or 100 years or 200 years.
yeah.
And of course, not to mention vested like business interests.
Yeah, it's a marathon versus a sprint, right? So
Yeah.
it's a 30-year perspective versus the 3, 4, 5-year cycle. Some really good questions that I'm just catching up on. So Danielle asks, movie is poignant in many ways, but do you think the focus on living in the forest perhaps exoticized the island or exoticizes the Caribbean despite strides made in development over the past 30 years? Tough one.
Yeah, maybe to some degree. But at the same time, if I did this project in the US or Canada and I still went to the forest, you wouldn't necessarily think that the whole country is just forest. That said, Dominica is a lot of forest, to be honest. It's 70,000 people on an island 26 miles long, but if you stretch it out flat, and we have
yeah, it's 62% forest.
Yeah.
A lot of forest, yeah.
And we are known as the Nature Isle of the Caribbean and
of the world.
And there you go. And we are in some ways also less developed. We don't have the same sort of like urban sprawl or big cities or anything else. So I get what you're saying. I get one of the issues with representation is right now my film is maybe one of the only films out of Dominica, but hopefully there'll be other films that show other aspects. It's just like before when there was sort of one black movie and that movie had to stand for all of black people. That's always going to sort of be a problem.
Correct. So Rooney says the people of Dominica should teach the world what climate change is and what resilience is. I'm just going to give some props to the Climate Resilience Execution Agency of Dominica. I think that's the whole point of setting up a delivery entity designed to help implement programs and initiatives to make the country resilient. But I think that it's not just about the people of the island or Dominica teaching the world. The world also has to meet us part way, halfway, a quarter of the way, whatever the way, to show that they trust that a country can take its own resilience into its hands, as opposed to having to rely on external support. Mm-hmm. So a couple of other forest-related questions. I'll bundle them. One, do you recommend going into the forest? By the way, I think forest bathing is very good for you, but that is a question. Second question around single-use plastics. Did you come across any where you were?
I came across like a banana bag the blue plastic banana bag,
Yeah.
one that was like caught on a root by the river.
Yeah. It comes with pesticides as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you recommend spending time in the forest? It's a tradition in many parts of the world, Japan, amongst other places.
Yeah, I mean, I think that some solo time in nature, whether it's the forest or the desert or the ocean, is always great. Even if it's not something like what I did. I mean, my first foray into something like that was my first backpacking experience of just 3 days up in the mountains with some friends. And that in itself was an eye-opener because, you know, we're so used to having these and a million notifications, and you know, we're talking about staying present and all these other things. These things make it very difficult. When you're out alone with nature, all of a sudden all of that noise falls away, your brain can sort of like calm down, and you can see how you're plugged into the larger living matrix of life. And I think it's only at that point that you can really sort of have an appreciation of everything and actually, I guess, say connect to it and want to save it in a meaningful way.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I'm trying to catch up again. There are, I'm going to come back to a question from Rooney, which is a little bit more philosophical, but a practical question around construction. Anything that you learned about building housing or maybe roofs, structures from your time in the forest that, that might be helpful for us to learn?
Yeah, bamboo is really sharp. I had cuts splitting bamboo. I had cuts all over my hands.
Okay.
But
So tougher hands or gloves.
yeah, but okay. So one, I mean, I made a simple A-frame, and then I ended up 4 posts of bamboo rafters, and then the Zalmush leaves provide good thatching. And even to sort of segue off of that, I was just recently at a friend's house, and it's like their grandmother, great grandparents' house. And this house has been around for generations, built in very traditional ways, and is still standing better than many homes. So kind of,
Right.
yeah.
And you see that across Dominica, but actually now I have to ask you the question, traditional Western or traditional Kalinago? Because you know that the Baunaute, the Kalinago gathering space on the Kalinago territory, and for those who don't know, the Kalinago are Dominica's first people, or First Nation. Their structures, the traditional structures, typically did not get as badly damaged, if damaged at all, compared to your more modern concrete plus galvanized without proper framing. So when you say traditional, you're talking about French architecture or Kalinago architecture?
I guess French in this instance.
And you see that across the island, right? So you see old houses. My uncle's house, 250 years old, but the techniques of building, and I don't know what this is formally called, but they didn't use nails.
Right, exactly. They use pegs. Yeah, slots and pegs.
Other things. His gutter fell off during Maria. That's it. That's it. And all around, you see the roofs flew off. Yeah.
And so that kind of goes to, you know, an element of the movie talking about, are we going backwards or forwards? Yeah. Which way should we be looking? And the way I see it, there are ancient or things from the past, things that still totally work for this day, that we should continue and hold on to those traditions. And then there are other things, there are modern developments and technologies that can also help us. So I think oftentimes we want to go black or white, old is good, new is bad, one or the other. And of course, it's always going to be a little bit more nuanced and trying to figure out how to put these things together for the best approach.
That's right. But I think, I mean, my own observation around more traditional or older housing or construction techniques is that it requires apprenticeship. It requires years of learning how to do this with your hands. It's not just about slapping things together and screwing them on. And I know that Dominica, and this is not by any means limited to this island, many parts of the world, people have forgotten or not had the opportunity to learn and be apprenticed, woodwork, metalwork, silversmithing, all of that stuff, blacksmithing, whatever it is that you need to build things, because we have become more robotic, more automated, more staple it together. And in some instances, clearly that works, right? You know, not every structure falls down in California or in Japan when there's an earthquake. It doesn't mean it doesn't work. But maybe for the types of structures that we're building in Dominica, there's something to be said about going back. Clearly, it would be hard to build skyscrapers, ancient technology. So back to a question from Rooney. How do you stay in the present moment?
How do you stay in the present moment? So
Rooney, you have a lot of questions. I can't answer.
No worries.
Oh, but he does ask, and how can we help you become a film producer and director? Maybe we should add that one in.
Well, I would say connect with me through social media at Uncivilized Film, or I'm also on Instagram as @Mike_please, and we can have a conversation. I am working on a screenplay right now, trying to write my first fiction screenplay. I've been taking online workshops on screenwriting and cinematography, other things. COVID has opened these sorts of events. I know Virtual Island Summit was going on before COVID, but so many things have now been made available online, which is fantastic, especially being in small, isolated islands. How do you stay in the present, though? I think that's a great question.
Yeah.
That's kind of the key, because let's say if you're looking for the answer, or you're looking for God, or you're looking for any of these things, the only place you'll ever find that is in the present. So to me, sometimes if you get caught up in the future, it's sort of, you're anxious. If you're caught up in the past, you can get depressed over the things that you've been missed and everything else. So meditation is one very good practice. It's essentially learning to just be present to any of the voice or thoughts that come up, learning to acknowledge them and let them go, and then trying to carry that practice onto daily life. And I do think that acknowledging death, accepting death, thinking about your life in a larger sort of spectrum is also very important, because I think it frees you from getting too caught up in sort of the thoughts and the games and everything else that society or people, your family or friends sort of try and hoist onto you, and that end up being a major distraction.
Yeah. I mean, I think those are all words of wisdom. It's mindfulness. It's, again, I'm not a yogi and I'm really bad at meditating, but I think the bottom line is to acknowledge your thoughts, to let them go, but also to feel your emotions. If you're fighting them too much, at least my personal experiences, they're going to come back. And by the way, you've got a whole halo going on right behind your head, on top of your halo hair. You got a whole guru halo going. Look, I mean, I think there are some really good points. Jocelyn, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, walked 3,000 kilometers across Europe. You know, for millennia, people have been, or at least centuries, people have been doing pilgrimages, in whatever form that comes, be it going to, be it Hajj or, going to monasteries or, the path across Spain or whatever it is. And I think that for me, at least, connecting the physical movement to your mind is a form of meditation. If it's just a repetition of your feet, one in front of the other, or running, it connects to your heartbeat. It's just boom, 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 boom. In some ways, perhaps that helps silence the other noise. I think fresh air helps, and movement helps, but none of these are going to be solutions. I'm trying to catch, so Waiti Kubuli National Trail, amazing trail across Dominica. I've only done very, very few bits of it. 200 kilometers, a bit longer, Michael?
I'm not sure.
Incredible trail. Lucan asks, Michael, how do you think your storytelling style differs from that of other Dominican filmmakers, if at all?
Well, we haven't really had any Dominican films. Maybe the last one, which I'm not sure if it was Dominican, was is it The Orchid House?
Yeah, actually my cousin made a film about Dominican independence a decade or so ago, but I don't know when The Orchid House was made.
But I mean, this is first person storytelling documentary. That's all I can say. At the end of the day, every person is going to do it differently. A question that I hear a lot is sort of about, is there sort of a Caribbean film aesthetic, and I think we're in such a nascent stage. It's a little difficult to say.
It's early days.
Yeah.
but I think it's really exciting to see that we have such a profound filmmaker. And honestly, the imagery is unbelievable. So listen, Rooney, you're going to have to get your own chat here. You're all we're not going to talk about the person who was seeing someone else, but she was a fool. So we're not going to talk about that.
Yeah, she's
But
great.
just,
She's great.
but you know, but there are questions around avocados, dasheen, papaya, or pawpaw, as we call it in the rainforest. Did they grow on their own? Did you bring them with you? Were you on land that was cultivated? And another land-related question, did you do any training or learn much about food, medicine, catch, gather, build shelter from an ancestral perspective before you went into the forest?
So I wanted to learn more, but there was some limitations. I did end up going out to the Kalinago territory, learning, being taught how to make bird traps. Someone made my crayfish pot for me. A guti trap, although I never ended up catching one. And then I also linked up with a botanist to go out in the forest and elsewhere to start identifying plants and understanding what's edible, what's not. But again, you could go so much further. I was trying to link up with someone who cultivates mushrooms, because fungi are such a great source of nutrition and protein, but if you don't know what you're doing, very dangerous. And so that one wasn't able to pan out. Where I was in the forest, there was, for instance, where I was getting the dasheen was an area that looked like it must have been cultivated at some time, but it was just sort of like a swamp, and the dasheen was still kind of growing. Like one in every 5 was not rotten, you know what I mean? But that's still plenty. And then I also so originally I kind of wanted to confine myself just to sort of like the wild forest land. But after I realized I'd been able to do this for like 3 weeks to a month, I was like, all right, I'm going to start expanding to, there were like sort of little gardens and stuff in the area. And so like the pawpaw and the avocado and stuff came from there. And originally part of how I wanted to do the film was sort of tracing mankind's walk from being exclusively hunter-gatherer to farming, and watching as the technology starts building more and more, because I kind of wanted to see, is where we are now inevitable? As soon as we invented fire, as soon as we understood farming, as soon as we realized we could make tools, were we instantly destined to essentially get to this point? And so obviously with Maria, things changed a little bit. There wasn't time to go into all of those.
Yeah.
Great question.
And I think, oh dear, I lost you for a second. Yeah, I mean, I think that's what's interesting about Maria, right? Everything was cut short. So whatever Dominica was doing before Maria, whatever you were building or doing before Maria, you just had to course correct. And so I imagine it was a bit of a rude awakening, everything curtailed. Look, we only have about 2 minutes. I'm happy to go over for a little bit, although I warn you, there may be the sound of little feet, my kids running around. A few people have asked where they can rewatch, and I know that it was posted earlier on. Do you want to just repost the link, Michael? So
yeah, I'll repost it, but I'll just say it's streaming at studioanansi.tv. I'm typing that right now. And then, of course, if you make it to the social media at Uncivilized Film, you'll also see all the links there. We're also streaming at the San Francisco Indie Doc Fest, actually tonight at 11 p.m. Eastern Time. And we'll also be at the Grenada Film Festival and the Greater Cleveland Urban Film Festival.
I'm seeing a lot of love from Hawaii. Thank you, Kiani. Dasheen is like kalo in Hawaii. Very important in the culture and full of calories. Good calories. A couple of questions just from my end. When the Prime Minister said Eden has fallen, or Eden is broken, in many ways, and again, many people believe that their island is Eden. In many ways, I think Dominica has an opportunity to not just, it's not about building back better, it's about protecting the blessings that the island has. And I really hope that we take resilience, not just climate resilience, but true resilience to heart. I hope that we're going in the right direction. If we're not, I count on you to stand up and say something about it. But more importantly, I think that maybe with COVID, people are realizing, tourism, I heard a horrifying statistic, and maybe Kiani can tell me if this is correct, that Hawaii went from having the lowest unemployment rate across any of the US states to the highest. Pre-COVID, the lowest, during COVID, the highest, up to 70% unemployment because of the reliance on tourism. I don't know if that's your experience as well, Kiani, but I heard this from a pretty solid source. That is petrifying. If at least you can feed your population and agriculture is undertaken in an environmentally respectful and a humanly, respectful manner, A, you're not chopping down the forest for it, B, you're not, pouring pesticides all over it. I think we have a bigger chance to really become resilient. There are many places that don't have that opportunity. Dominica has water, abundant fresh water. We have geothermal energy, we have solar power, we have hydropower, we have every possible crop you can imagine. Not every island has that. I think about Antigua and Barbados. I think about some of the drier islands in the Caribbean and other parts of the world where you are reliant on imports. If agriculture isn't an option, recognizing that the digital economy is a wave of the future, given the choice between kind of going digital, where people are increasingly isolated, and focusing on tourism, is there a better of the two evils? Is there an alternative pathway?
Well, I think part of the issue in terms of resilience is not having all your eggs in one basket. So if, when something like this happens, tourism is gone. But then again, if another Maria happens and no one has internet,
is gone.
or we have no internet, also digital economy could be challenged. Yeah. So I think, we're going to have to explore lots of different routes. I do think, though, the digital economy can play a really great role for island nations, essentially, kind of allowing us to access larger markets without having to be resource heavy. We're using human resources, essentially, and utilizing them. Yeah, I don't know. I'd say I'm quite positive about it.
So diversification, I think. I mean, that is where that's possible, I think is critical. We developed the Climate Resilience and Recovery Plan for Dominica, and looking at opportunities to diversify and to look at higher value products. So you're not just, maintaining the position, I will not use a word that I used a year ago, kind of maintaining the position of exporting raw, unprocessed or labeled or poorly marketed products, because otherwise you lose the value, and we've already done that for a few hundred years. Yeah. So look, we are a few minutes over 6. I will ask if anyone has additional burning questions.
Cool. I also just wanted to mention, I mentioned in the chat, but one of the books that I think it's my personal favorite book, and I think also to this audience would be a really interesting book. It's called Island by Aldous Huxley. Probably know Huxley for Brave New World, which is like dystopian one, but Island was his final book, and it was his utopian counterpoint to Brave New World that still wasn't overly optimistic and doesn't end all peachy, but he really, it took him, years of research and years writing, and he tried to synthesize all the different things he'd learned, going from, sustainable agriculture to humanism, to political structures, to psychedelics, everything essentially incorporated into how do you essentially create a viable society, which in this case is on an island. It's a fiction set on an island where people can be whole and live in balance with the world. To me, so far, it's the best thing, the closest thing I've read to a roadmap to the future, and still seems just as relevant today as to when it was written.
Well, hold up. Thank you for not telling me about that while we were doing the resilience strategy. I really don't appreciate that. I'm actually going to go pick it up right now. Look, I've been told by James and Christian, our esteemed island innovation gurus who have made all of this possible, that this video is going to cut in a couple of minutes, maybe in a minute. So please don't feel offended if you're dropped. I want to thank you, Michael, for an amazing film. Thank you to everyone for the comments in the chat. I'm sorry if I missed anything burning. Michael, if so, can you let me know?
Well, people can always reach out to us.
Yeah, exactly.
They know where to find us.
You can find us. More importantly, you can find Michael. So thanks so much. Keep up the passion for all that is good in Dominica. And look forward to seeing more of you and hearing more about you. And a shout out to anyone on the chat If you are connected to people in the film space, in the cultural space, in the art space that wants to connect with Michael, please make that link. I think it'd be much appreciated from an Islander, but also from clearly a brilliant filmmaker. Thanks, everyone.
Well, thank you, guys.
Thanks, Michael. We'll chat. Bye.